and welcome to Stories for Wonderful Children. I'm Dan Wendelin, your host and storyteller. Years ago, I began recording the bedtime stories I told my children every night. Now, I'd like to share those stories with you. I hope you enjoy my Stories for Wonderful Children. There's a little girl named Winella, and she lives in a very quiet house, in a very quiet neighborhood, in a very quiet city. It's all very quiet because the music fairies of Treble have been imprisoned and prevented from working their magic by the Miscondutor who has summoned the silence. Winella has already freed several of the music fairies, but she has discovered that the next music fairy, Fa, is being held captive by the Miscondutor and his rests, who are waiting for Winella to try to come free her. Winella stepped off the Cat's Paw Highway. She had been traveling for much of the day from one place to another, getting her friends to come and help her. She looked behind her as she stepped off and saw them arriving on the Cat's Paw Highway. Flibberty-Gibbet, the great tiger, Joey, and the tickling wolf, and the sad bear, all come to help her, come to stand beside her in defeating the evil of the Miscondutor and his silence. She looked at each of them and said, "Okay, we all know the plan now, right?" And they all nodded to her.
What was the plan?
Then
What was the plan?
you'll have to listen and find out. And then May Sarah took Flibberty-Gibbet and the tickling wolf on her back, and Joey took Winella and the sad bear on her back, and they flew across the land of Treble to where Winella had seen on the map in the stream that Fa was being held. They landed a little before they got to the area where they thought Fa was, and Winella knew that they were in the right place, because when they all listened carefully, they could hear a terrible screeching, banging, nails on a chalkboard, forks across a plate, terrible racket. Winella looked at the others and whispered, "That's the sound of the Miscondutor." So they each went their separate ways, and Winella crawled forward slowly until she reached the edge of a clearing. She saw a fairy in the center of the clearing. The fairy was green from head to toe. Her eyes were green, her hair was green, her skin was green, her wings were a sparkling green, and her dress was a beautiful deep forest green. But standing next to her was a hideous little man dressed all in black, and when she looked carefully, she could see the shadows of the rests prowling around the edges of the clearing. Winella waited there quietly, and after a moment, she saw Joey come swooping down out of the sky. On his back was someone dressed in Winella's best dress, and looking very much like her. Now Winella knew that it was the sad bear, and that the omni-harp that he had in his hand was really just a Kleenex box that they'd painted silver. But as Joey dove out of the sky, he whistled at the top of his voice, and all the rest looked up, and their shadows melted and shivered until they weren't cat shadows anymore. They were bird shadows, and they took to the air after him, and Joey flew off like a shot. And Winella thought, good, 3 down. Now, what next? Then she saw the Miscondutor look up and look around. And when she saw that, she saw on the other side of the clearing, she saw Flibberty-Gibbet lope into the clearing with the tickling wolf on his back. And the tickling wolf was wearing another one of Winella's dresses, so that if you didn't know what Winella looked like and you didn't look very closely, you might think it was Winella. And the Misconductor said,
"Ha! Now I have you, little girl. No more fairies for you to free."
and he pointed his conducting baton at them, and a black, dark light shot out of it, and it hit Flibbertigibbet and the wolf, and all of a sudden they were both making the most terrible noises. Flibbertigibbet has a deep tiger voice, and he was making this sound. He was going, meow, 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 like just a little day-old kitten. And the tickling wolf, who was usually laughing and tickling, was crying like this. And Flibbertigibbet and the tickling wolf shot back out of the clearing. But while they had distracted the Misconductor, Winella had been crawling across the clearing toward the fairy. And she was almost to the fairy when the Misconductor turned around and saw her and said,
"Ah, thought to trick me, did you?"
And he took his conducting baton and he pointed it at her, and the black light shot out of it, and at the last second Winella held up the omni-harp, and the black light hit the harp, and it made a terrible twanging sound, and then the black light bounced right back off it and shot right back toward the Misconductor, and he made a yelp of surprise and ducked out of the way, while Winella turned and ran out of the clearing, and she could hear the crackling of brush behind her, that the Misconductor was right behind her. And so she did the only thing she could think of. She reached down to the omni-harp and she played what was her favorite song right then. And can you guess what that was?
What?
You have to guess.
Lightly.
It was Lightly Row. That's right, she played it. And she played, as she played it, and as she ran, she sang as well as she could while she was singing. She sang, lightly row, step right up to lightly row. This is part two, this is part two. Skip right up here for part two. And the Misconductor made a terrible,
"Oh, stop that! Hello, rabbit!"
and he was slowing down to get further away from her. And Winella continued to sing as loud as she could while still running. I'll stay home and play, then move. I'll stay home and play, then move. This is part two, this is part two. Skip right up here for part two. And she reached the top of a hill and she jumped down over the other side and landed on Joey's back, right next to the sad bear. And he took to the air and flew off, and Winella said, "Did you lose the rests, Joey?" And he said, "Oh yeah, they're lost down near the river. I lost them easily. There's nothing faster than me in the skies." And he took off into the air, and as they flew away from the Misconductor, they quickly saw, looking back toward the clearing, that Sarah had swooped down out of the sky. Once Winella had lured the Misconductor away, she had freed Fa from where she was tied up, and had now taken to the air with Flibbertigibbet and the wolf once again on her back, and Fa flying alongside her. They all flew back to the Cat's Paw Highway, where Fa said, "Thank you so much, Winella." Winella looked down and she could see that Fa had in her hand a gourd that rattled when she shook it. And Fa said, "I am the fairy of the music and the sounds that are made by plants, the rustling of the trees, and the swishing sound of the grass, and the rustling of fall leaves on an autumn day." She said, "I must go and bring those sounds back to the world. What will you do now?" And Winella said, "Well, I suppose I must go find Soul, but it's getting late, so first my friends and I must go home and get a good night's sleep." And Fa nodded and said, "You have done well, Winella. I know the conductor is pleased with you. But be careful, the Misconductor hunts you now. He does not want you to free my sisters Soul and Tea, and he will do everything in his power to stop you." And Winella smiled and said, "I think I'll be okay. I have friends." And with that, she and her friends stepped on the Cat's Paw Highway, turned around 3 times, saying, Cat's Paw Highway, Cat's Paw Highway, a Cat's Paw Highway. Take us where we want to go. And they all went very fast back to their homes, where they got a good night's rest, because the next day was going to be a long day. Winella intended to free both Soul and Tea and bring music back to the world and banish the silence.
Thanks for listening to Stories for Wonderful Children. I created, told, and edited today's story. Questions and witty commentary were supplied by my children. The music was composed by Brandon Thompson. If you enjoy the show, please tell someone about it, or leave a review on your podcast provider. Our email is storiesforwonderfulchildren@gmail.com. You can also contact us on Facebook or Twitter. I'll see you next time.